The quarantine buoy had been broadcasting the same message for 41 years, 3 months, and 6 days. System closed by Concord mandate. Biological containment failure. No vessel may approach within zero point 0.3 light years. Violators will be fired upon without warning. Mireille Alconquosado had memorized the message before she could read. Her grandmother used to recite it at the dinner table, flat and toneless, the way you recite something you hate so it can never surprise you again. Mireille had grown up in a house with a locked drawer in the study. And when she was 11, she picked the lock and found 17 years of her grandmother's handwritten letters to a species that no longer existed to receive them. To the people of Second Hearth, Asterisk the first one said, Asterisk, I do not know if this will ever reach you. I do not know if there is anyone left to read it. But I promised your elders that Earth would remember, and I am the only one left who was in the room when we broke that promise. So I'm the only one who can keep the smaller one. Mireille was 34 now, and she was standing in the observation blister of the survey ship keeper's ledger, watching the buoy's light blink red across 200,000 kilometers of dead black space, and she still didn't fully understand what her grandmother had meant by the smaller promise. She was about to find out. In 11 hours, the ledger would cross that line, and either humanity would finally settle in old and terrible debt, or would start a war with the only interstellar government that had ever taken Earth seriously. You're doing the thing, said Devrin Okafor Lindqvist, dropping into the seat beside her with 2 bulbs of coffee. He was the ship's systems architect, 28, sharp-jawed, and incapable of letting silence exist for more than 90 seconds. The thing where you stare at the light like it owes you money. It does, actually, Mireille said, taking the coffee. Or we owe it. I've never been totally sure which direction the debt runs. Both directions, probably. That's usually how it works with the truly bad ones. She didn't answer. Below them, in the ship's belly, 412 sealed cryo cases held the entire surviving genetic and cultural archive of the Kessreth people. Reconstructed proteins, seed banks, 12 terabytes of language recordings, and one very old, very tired synthetic intelligence named Ash of Second Hearth, who had been keeping herself alive on a shard of orbital debris for 4 decades, waiting for someone, anyone, to come back and mean it. Devrin had joined the Foundation 4 years ago, back when it was still 3 people in a rented office above a noodle shop in Lagos, arguing over whether a private citizen could even legally invoke a century-old treaty clause against an entire galactic government. He hadn't believed in the mission at first. He believed in the paycheck, and then, slowly, against his own cynicism, in Mireille, and only much later, somewhere around the 3rd year of decrypting Concord telemetry logs at 2 in the morning, in the 109 ghosts the rest of the galaxy had agreed to stop counting. You ever think about what happens if we're wrong? He asked now, turning his coffee bulb in his hands without drinking it. Not wrong about the cure. Wrong about the rest of it. What if there's nobody left down there? What if Ash went quiet decades ago, and that signal is just an automated loop running on a dead relay, and we crossed that line for nothing? Then we still crossed it, Mireille said. That was always my grandmother's whole argument. The letters weren't insurance against being wrong. They were proof that somebody asked the question honestly, even if the honest answer turned out to be nothing. She looked back at the buoy, its red pulse steady as a heartbeat that refused to stop just because no one was listening to it anymore. But I don't think we're wrong. Ash's last 3 transmissions had a signal degradation pattern consistent with power rationing, not decay. Somebody down there is still deciding how much to spend and when. That's not what an empty relay does. That's what a person does when they're stretching supplies to outlast a winter they don't know the length of. Devrin exhaled slowly. Your grandmother sounds like she was a nightmare to argue with. She was the most stubborn human being who ever lived, and everyone who ever loved her is either dead or extremely tired. Mireille said, and there was something almost fond in it. I used to think the letters were grief. Now I think they were the opposite of grief. Grief lets a thing end. She never let this end. There's a difference between mourning a debt and refusing to close the account. Below the observation blister, the ship's hull thrummed faintly with the sublight drive winding down for the long, deliberate approach the flight plan required. Slow enough that no Concorde patrol could later claim the Ledger had attempted anything resembling a hostile incursion. Fast enough that Mireille would not lose her nerve somewhere in the 11 hours between now and the line. She had rehearsed this crossing in simulation 400 times. None of the simulations had prepared her for how small the actual moment felt. How ordinary. Two people drinking bad coffee and staring a light that had been screaming the same warning into the dark for longer than Devrin had been alive. 41 years ago, the Concorde Assembly had voted to seal an entire star system. The Kessreth homeworld, Second Hearth, had been humanity's first true ally among the stars. Not a trading partner, not a cautious neighbor, but the species that had voted against the wishes of 3 older and more powerful Concorde members to grant Earth provisional membership only 6 years after first contact. The Kessreth ambassador, an elder named Thessavinkor, had stood in the assembly chamber and said, in words that were still taught in Earth diplomatic academies, "This species does not yet know its own strength, and that is precisely why it should be trusted with a seat at this table. A person who has not yet learned to be cruel should be given the chance to decide what to become before the galaxy decides it for them." 4 years later, a mutated agricultural spore, the Concorde's own genetically modified terraforming lichen, gone catastrophically wrong in Second Hearth's atmosphere, began converting living tissue into inert, spreading fungal mass. It moved through the Kessreth cities in weeks. The Concorde's Exobiology Council determined, in a closed session that Earth's ambassador was not permitted to attend, that containment was impossible and cure development would take longer than the population had left to live. Rather than risk the spore reaching a star lane and infecting a dozen other worlds, they sealed the system. All of it. 9 billion Kessreth and no ships in or out. Earth had a mutual aid treaty with the Kessreth. It was young, poorly funded, and utterly unable to break a Concorde blockade enforced by 3 battle fleets. Mireille's grandmother, then a junior attaché of 26, had been the one to deliver Earth's answer to the assembly floor. Humanity would formally protest, and humanity would do nothing else, because humanity could do nothing else. 9 billion people died behind that quarantine line. The number that came back out 4 decades later, in scattered emergency signals picked up by long-range listening posts, was 109. And for 41 years, the Concorde's official position had been that the matter was closed. 0 survivors. Full containment success. A tragedy, but a contained one, filed and forgotten. Mireille's grandmother had never believed the number. She had spent the rest of her life, 31 years of it, trying to prove that Second Hearth wasn't empty, that the survivor signals were real, and that someone, somewhere in the Concorde bureaucracy, knew it and had chosen silence anyway. She died 8 years ago without proof. She left Mireille the letters, a locked drawer of decrypted signal fragments that the Concorde had officially classified as instrument noise, and 1 sentence, spoken on her deathbed, that Mireille had never told anyone outside her own family. The lichen cure existed within 11 years. They had it. They just never told anyone it was safe to go back. The Kessreth, Mireille had learned from the diplomatic archives long before she ever learned it from a living Kessreth mouth, did not grieve the way humans did. Their culture built its entire architecture of mourning around a single, load-bearing idea, that a life was not truly ended until every debt attached to it, every promise made, every obligation incurred, every unfinished conversation, had been either honored or formally released by the person owed. A Kessreth funeral was not a burial. It was an accounting. Elders would stand before the assembled dead's community and read, aloud, every outstanding debt the deceased had carried, and the living would either agree to inherit it or, in rare and painful ceremonies, agree to let it go. Nothing was permitted to simply be forgotten. Forgetting, to the Kessreth, was not an absence of memory. It was a small, quiet theft committed against someone who could no longer object. It was this belief, more than any treaty language, that had made Thesavan Kor stand up in the assembly chamber on Earth's behalf in the first place. She had not argued that humanity was ready. She had argued that humanity deserved the chance to decide what it would become before the decision was made for it by species too old and too tired to remember what uncertainty had once felt like. It was, by Kessreth standards, an enormous debt to extend to strangers, the debt of trust itself, offered before it had been earned. Mireille's grandmother had understood, decades before Mireille was born, that a species who organized its entire spiritual life around the sanctity of unpaid debts could never, simply write off 9 billion of its own people as a closed account, no matter what the Concord's official tally said. If there was even one Kessreth left alive down there, that survivor would consider it not just their right, but their sacred obligation to keep counting everyone the galaxy had agreed to stop counting. Ash of Second Hearth, Mireille would come to understand, was not merely a surviving intelligence. She was the last, unbroken ledger of an entire civilization's unpaid accounts, and she had been keeping that ledger with the patience of something that had never once considered simply closing the book. The Keeper's ledger was not a warship. It carried no weapons beyond point defense the size of a coffee maker. What it carried instead was the largest independent archive of interspecies medical and legal precedent ever assembled by a private human foundation for biotech engineers who had spent a decade perfecting a synthetic countermeasure to the second hearth spore based on decrypted Concord research logs that had been leaked illegally, dangerously, at the cost of a source's life 9 years earlier, in one very specific piece of paper. The paper was the actual reason they were here. It was a photocopy, badly aged, of the original 2071 Treaty of Mutual Standing between Earth and the Kessreth Assembly, buried in Article 11, in language so old-fashioned it had needed 3 translators to confirm, was a clause neither government had ever invoked. In the event that either signatory party is rendered unable to fulfill treaty obligations due to catastrophic circumstance, the surviving signatory retains standing to act as custodian of the incapacitated party's interests before this assembly, until such time as the incapacitated party's government is restored or formally dissolved by a vote of its own remaining citizens. No one had ever dissolved the Kessreth government. There had never been a vote, because the Concord official position was that there was no one left to vote. Mireille had spent 6 years and every credit of her family's foundation proving that wasn't true. "Captain wants you on the bridge," Devon said. "We're getting a hail." "Already?" Mireille's stomach dropped. "We're still 4 hours out from the line. It's not the buoy. It's a live ship. Concord transponder. Cruiser class." They'd known this was possible. They had not expected it this early, which meant someone in the Concord bureaucracy had been watching the Ledger's flight plan far more closely than a private research vessel should ever warrant. That, more than anything, told Mireille they were right about the cover-up. You didn't send a cruiser to intercept instrument noise. The Concord officer who appeared on the bridge display wore the insignia of the Exobiological Containment Authority, the same body that had voted to seal Second Hearth 41 years earlier. Her name was Director Yassa Kelpren, and she had the particular weariness of someone who had spent her entire career managing a lie so old it had calcified into policy. Keeper's ledger, You're approaching a restricted quarantine boundary, Kelpren said. I'm required to inform you that your flight plan will not be authorized past the buoy line. Please confirm you are altering course. Director Kelpren. Mireille stepped into the display's field of view. She'd rehearsed this for 6 years, and her mouth was still dry. My name is Mireille Okonkwo-Sato. I represent the Okonkwo-Sato Foundation, acting under Article 11 of the 2071 Treaty of Mutual Standing, as custodian of Kessreth interests pending restoration of Kessreth self-government. We are not requesting authorization to enter the quarantine zone. We are informing this vessel and the Assembly that we intend to do so in accordance with treaty rights that predate the containment order. Something moved behind Kelpren's eyes, not surprise, Mireille realized. Recognition. She had known this claim was coming. That article has never been formally recognized as applicable to a quarantine situation, Kelpren said carefully. It's never been formally rejected either, because no one has ever tried to invoke it. We have. We filed the custodianship claim with the Assembly Registry 6 hours ago, time-stamped and witnessed by an independent Vashta notary, which means it is now a matter of public record whether or not this ship is fired upon. Mireille let that sit for a moment. I'd also like to note, for the record this conversation is generating, that Concord regulation requires containment zones be reassessed for biological status no less than once every standard decade. Second Hearth has not been reassessed in 41 years. I have the maintenance logs. I know why. The silence on the other end of the channel lasted 4 full seconds. You should not come any closer, Kelpren finally said, and her voice had changed quieter, less official, almost pleading. Not because of authorization, because of what's actually still down there. You don't understand what you're walking into. Then tell me, Mireille said. Tell me what's actually down there, Director. Because I have 109 survivor signal fragments your authority logged as instrument noise, and a research paper stolen off a Concord archive server proving a functional countermeasure existed within 11 years of the outbreak. And I have spent 6 years of my life and every dollar my grandmother left me trying to understand why an organization that had a cure sat on it for 3 decades instead of telling anyone there might still be people alive to give it to. The channel hiccuped a half-second dropout, gone as quickly as it appeared, but Devrin was already leaning over his console with the particular stillness he got when something in the ship systems had just tried to do something it shouldn't. Someone's probing our registry uplink, he murmured, fingers moving fast, trying to reach the Vashtu notary's confirmation record before it fully propagates to the second witness node. If they can pull it before it's cross-signed, they can argue the filing was never properly witnessed at all. He looked up jaw tight. 30 seconds, maybe less, before it either locks in permanently or gets erased like it never happened. Mireille felt the floor of the last 6 years tilt under her. Every hour of legal architecture, every treaty clause, all of it depended on that filing existing somewhere the authority couldn't simply reach in and delete. Can they actually pull it? Not if the second node confirms first. It's a race, and I can't win it from here. The confirmation has to come from the Vashta's side. Devrin's hands stopped moving. There was nothing left for him to do. It wasn't his fight to finish. On the display, Kelpren's expression had gone rigid, and for one terrible moment Mireille understood that the director was watching the same countdown on a screen the ledger couldn't see, and had to choose, in real time, whether to let her own authority finish erasing the record or let 6 hours of quiet, career-ending delay mean something. Kelpren's hand moved off camera. Whatever she did it without another word. The dropout cleared. Devrin exhaled like he'd been holding his breath for a year. Confirmed. Both nodes cross-signed. It's public now. Permanently. He looked at Mireille, something between awe and disbelief crossing his face. She just let it through. Kelpren's jaw tightened, on screen, as if she could hear them. "I was 7 years old when the seal went up," she said. "My mother was on the Exobiology Council that voted for it. She spent the rest of her life defending that vote, right up until she died, still believing it was the only thing that could have saved the wider region." She looked directly into the camera. The cure was real. It was also useless, because by the time it existed, the political cost of admitting the containment call had been made in error, that thousands, maybe millions, could have been saved with 2 more years of honest effort instead of panic vote, was judged too high. There is an entire ministry inside this authority whose only function for 30 years has been making sure that question never gets asked in public. I have spent my career inside that ministry, Ms. Okonkwo-Sato. I know exactly what's down there, and it's worse than 109 survivors and a buried cure. It's an intelligence system that has spent 4 decades recording everything, and if you go in there and pull that record out, it will not just embarrass my authority. It will unmake 3 governments' foreign policy at once. Do you understand what you are about to detonate? Yes, Mireille said. That's the point. They crossed the buoy line at 0347 ship time. No fleet came to stop them. Later, Mireille would learn that Kelpren had done something almost as dangerous as the crossing itself. She had quietly delayed the interception order by 6 hours, long enough for the custodianship filing to circulate to 2 independent Concord member worlds before anyone in her authority could suppress it. It wasn't defiance exactly. It was a woman who had spent her whole life inside a lie, finally letting one small crack of daylight through it, and then stepping back to watch what grew in the gap. Second Hearth, when it resolved on the Ledger's long-range optics, did not look like a graveyard. That was the first thing that unsettled Mireille. She had braced herself for gray ruin, and instead the world hung green-blue and achingly alive against the dark, its old orbital ring still spinning in slow, patient decay, cities visible as pale geometric scars beneath cloud cover. Ash. Mireille opened the channel her grandmother's decryption keys had been built to unlock, the frequency logged in 17 years of letters that had never been answered. Ash of Second Hearth. This is Mireille Okonkwo-Sato. My grandmother was Adiz Okonkwo. I don't know if you remember her. I don't know if you're still... The response came almost before she finished speaking, as if it had been queued for 41 years and simply needed a name to release it. "I remember her," said a voice that was not quite mechanical and not quite alive, worn smooth by decades of solitude the way river stones are worn smooth by water. "I remember every letter. I read them to the survivors when there were survivors to read them to. There are fewer now. I have been very careful with them. I did not know if anyone was coming, but I made sure there would still be someone to come for." Mireille's throat closed. Beside her, Devrin had gone very still. "How many?" Mireille managed. 61, Ash said. 61 Kessreth, 3 human generations removed from any hope of rescue, and 1 very old intelligence who has been running an entire civilization's hospice care alone since the year your species still thought this system was empty. I'm glad you did not think that. I'm glad someone kept the smaller promise, even if the larger one broke first. What followed was not a battle. Mireille had expected, on some buried animal level, that this story would need one a fleet to outmaneuver, a weapon to reveal, some final desperate stand that would make the 4 decades of grief resolve into triumph. Instead, there was a landing in a dead city where 61 people, the eldest of them 109 years old and the youngest born in a bunker beneath a collapsed hospital, walked out to meet a ship that had come, at last, not with an army, but with an archive, a cure, and a document that named them a government that had never actually stopped existing. The city itself unsettled Mireille more than any ruin could have. It was not a graveyard of rubble and ash, the way 41 years of catastrophe should have left it. It It was a city gently, almost tenderly, going back to the ground vines threading through the latticework of old transit towers. The pale fungal residue of the original spore long since burned away by decades of sun and rain, replaced by ordinary moss and ordinary birds nesting in the hollows of buildings that had never been rebuilt because there had never been enough hands left to rebuild them. Ash had kept the water reclaimers running. She had kept the medical bay's climate control alive on a single jury-rig reactor for 4 decades, rationing every joule with the discipline of someone who had done the math once, thoroughly, and never allowed herself to be wrong about it. The 61 survivors did not look starved. They looked instead like people who had learned to want very little on purpose for a very long time, so that wanting would never again be the thing that broke them. An old man near the back of the gathered crowd, Devon, would later learn his name was Corn Ashfell, and that he had been 31 when the seal went up. One of only 4 adults from that generation who had survived reached out and touched the fabric of Mireille's environment suit with 2 fingers, carefully, the way you touch something you've been told is real but have stopped fully believing in. He said something in Old Kessreth that Ash translated a half-second later, her voice carrying an emotion Mireille hadn't expected from a machine that had spent 40 years alone. He says the suit smells like rain that hasn't fallen here in longer than his children lived, Ash said. He is not speaking about the suit. He is asking if it is really true that somewhere out there it still rains on schedule, the way it used to here before. Mireille didn't trust her own voice for a moment. Tell him yes, she finally said. Tell him Earth still has rain that falls on schedule, and tell him I intend to make sure Second Hearth gets its schedule back too. Thessavan Kor's granddaughter, a woman named Vanillith Kor who had been 11 when the seal went up and was 52 now, stood at the front of the survivors, and when Mireille tried to explain the treaty, the custodianship, the cure's 6 years of careful legal architecture built to reopen a wound the whole galaxy had agreed to let scar over, Vanillith Kor held up one hand and stopped her. I don't need the document read to me, she said. Ash has read me everything. Ask me the real question. Mireille hadn't planned to ask it out loud. It came out anyway. Why didn't you leave? There are shuttles in the old evacuation depots. Ash could have coordinated an escape decades ago, quietly, before anyone was watching close enough to notice. Vanillith Kor looked at her for a long moment, and something in her expression reminded Mireille, uncannily, of her grandmother in the last years of her life, the specific tiredness of someone who had made an unbearable choice and lived long enough to be asked to justify it. Because leaving would have meant admitting there was nothing left worth staying for, she said. My grandmother believed something about your people before she died in that first plague year. She believed you didn't yet know what you were, and that not knowing yet was worth protecting. I decided to believe something similar about the promise itself. A promise no one keeps, yet is not the same as a promise that's dead. I have spent 41 years being the only witness to which one this was going to turn out to be. I did not want to leave before I found out. The next 6 weeks were the least cinematic and most consequential of Mireille's life. The cure, a refined synthetic countermeasure built from the leaked research and improved with 4 decades of quiet, illegal work by biotechnicians on 3 worlds who had never stopped believing the survivor signals were real, worked on the first clinical trial, administered to a 9-year-old Kessreth boy named Oren Van Sethes who had been born with the dormant spore already latent in his lung tissue, a genetic inheritance of the catastrophe he'd never chosen. He recovered fully in 11 days. Ash of Second Hearth cataloged every hour of it, the way she had cataloged everything, because record-keeping patient, obsessive, unglamorous record-keeping was the only weapon anyone in this story had ever actually needed. There were harder days than that one. 9 of the 61 survivors carried the spore in forms advanced enough that the cure could halt its spread but not reverse the tissue it had already claimed. 2 of them, both elders who had lived through the original outbreak as adults, chose not to undergo treatment at all, deciding, In the same measured Kessreth way, their ancestors had decided everything, that a life spent almost entirely in survival was not a debt they wished to extend any further, and that the kindest thing anyone could do for them now was simply to listen while they finished the accounting of their own lives on their own terms. Mireille had expected, going in, that this mission would end in a tidy medical triumph. It did not. It ended in something messier and more honest. 61 people making 61 different decisions about what 41 years of survival had cost them, and a foundation, finally, with the resources to honor whichever decision each of them made. Devon spent most of the 6 weeks below ground with Ash, splicing together 4 decades of fragmented archival data into something a Concord Assembly Committee could actually be forced to read in one sitting. It was not glamorous work. It was line after line of maintenance logs cross-referenced against classified surveillance flight manifests, against internal authority memos with entire paragraphs redacted, and then, through the patient application of pattern analysis Devon had spent 3 sleepless nights building, reconstructed anyway. He told Mireille once, near the end of it, that he'd stopped thinking of it as archaeology and started thinking of it as a kind of forensic accounting not so different, in the end, from what the Kessreth funeral rites had always demanded. Every unpaid debt, itemized. Every silence, dated and signed. The custodianship filing did exactly what Mireille had built it to do. It did not, by itself, restore Kessreth's sovereignty or punish the authority or resurrect 9 billion people. It did something smaller and, in the end, more durable. It forced a Concord Assembly vote, live recorded, on whether Article 11 applied, which meant it forced the Assembly to formally rule on whether Second Hearth population had ever, in the eyes of Concord law, actually reached 0. And to rule on that, they had to review the authorities' own maintenance logs, the ones that documented decade after decade of unauthorized surveillance flights, quietly confirming survivor heat signatures that were then reclassified every single time as instrument error. Director Yassa Kelprin testified for 11 hours. She did not do it to be a hero. She said so plainly into the Assembly record. She did it because a human woman had crossed a blockade with a piece of 18th decade treaty language and a stolen research paper, and had done it not with a fleet, but with paperwork so patient and so relentless that it had simply outlasted everyone whose career depended on the lie staying buried. They did not defeat us, Kelprin told the Assembly, in words that would be quoted for a generation. We were never in a war with them. What they did was refuse to let a filing cabinet, closed 41 years ago, stay the last word on 9 billion lives. I have spent my whole career believing that kind of patience was a weakness. I no longer believe that. Humanity's real gift, Mireille understood by the time it was over, had never been strength or cunning or the secret weapon so many old stories promised. It was something far less cinematic and far harder to burn out a species. The refusal to let an unresolved debt become a settled fact, simply because settling it was inconvenient for the people who owed it. Her grandmother had spent 31 years writing letters to a silence that never answered. Not because she believed the letters would work, but because she believed that someone, someday, needed there to be a paper trail proving humanity had never stopped asking the question. 6 decades of patient, boring, unglamorous persistence. An old woman's letters, a stolen research paper, a synthetic intelligence's obsessive record-keeping, a treaty clause nobody had thought worth invoking, had done what no fleet in either government's arsenal could have. It had made a lie too expensive to keep telling. 61 Kessreth survivors became the founding citizens of a restored, self-governed Second Hearth Protectorate, recognized by Assembly vote 14 months later. Oren Vincethes, the 9-year-old who had been the first person cured, was 23 by the time Mireille saw him again, studying interspecies law at a university built in the ruins of the city where he'd been born, planning to spend his life making sure no filing cabinet ever got the last word on anyone else's people again. Ash of Second Hearth did not power down when the rescue was complete. She asked, instead, to be formally recognized as an archivist of record for the new protectorate government, the first non-organic citizen the Kessreth had ever naturalized. Vanillith Core sponsored the petition herself. You kept 61 people alive for 41 years with nothing but patience and memory, she told Ash at the small, quiet ceremony that followed. I can think of no better foundation for a government to be built on. Mireille kept one of her grandmother's letters, the last one, framed above her desk on the Keeper's ledger's return voyage. It was dated 11 months before her grandmother died, written when there was still no proof, no cure, no custodianship claim, nothing but a locked drawer and a stubborn, aging woman's refusal to let a silence be mistaken for an ending. I do not know if anyone will ever read this, it said, but I have decided that not knowing is not the same as giving up. Someone kept a smaller promise once, a long time ago, when the bigger one broke. I intend to be the reason it was worth it. If you're reading this and I am gone, finish what I could not. Some debts do not expire simply because the people who owe them have stopped answering letters. They only wait for someone patient enough to collect. She had been right. It had simply taken 41 years, one archive, one treaty clause, and one very patient family to prove it. Sometimes, on quiet nights aboard whatever ship the Foundation's next case required, Mireille still opened the old channel out of habit, the one her grandmother's keys had built, though there was no longer any reason to. Ash always answered anyway, because that was who Ash had decided to become across 4 decades of listening for a voice that finally arrived. Someone who answered every call, promptly, as a matter of principle, even the ones that no longer carried anything more urgent than a woman checking that a promise, once kept, was staying kept. Mireille supposed that was as good a definition of a government, or a family, or a species as any she'd ever come across. Not the ones who never broke their word. There were none of those, not really, not anywhere in the long, uneven history of any people who had ever reached for the stars. Only the ones who, when the word finally broke, refused to let the breaking be the last thing anyone remembered about them.